Hi, everyone. I wanted to highlight for you some of the theoretical, philosophical, and practical similarities and differences between qualitative and quantitative research traditions. As you read about both last week in your Gay Mills and Eurasian text in Chapter 1, and this week in the reading that we posted for you by Corinne Glesney, Meeting Qualitative Inquiry, which incidentally is the first chapter of her book, now in its fourth edition, called Becoming Qualitative Researchers. I really like the Gay Mills and Eurasian text that we're using for this course. I think those authors do a great job of demystifying the research process, giving credence to both traditions, both qualitative and quantitative, and make research procedures quite clear in a number of different methodologies that are presented in the text. However, I do think that the book is still somewhat biased in favor of quantitative methods, and you'll understand more about that as the semester proceeds. But one of the ways that you can tell that is the structure of the language. It's written in a very post-positivist tradition. In fact, as you read the chapter on meeting qualitative inquiry for this week, I hope one of the first things that you noticed was the very personal account and personal sense of Glesney that you get from her writing. She does this in a few ways. She uses first person language, obviously. She also shares with you a bit about her childhood, what intrigued her and attracted her to qualitative research, her scholarship in and her training in ethnography and anthropology and many of her works to give you a real sense of the person and the researcher that she is. And this is very much in line with qualitative values. So let's spend a few minutes looking at predispositions of positivist and interpretivist approaches to research, which is exhibit 1.1 on page 9 of Glesney's chapter. So on the left-hand column is the positivist approach, which by now you recognize that this is associated with quantitative research traditions and methods. And in the right-hand column is an interpretivist approach, which is the approach that Glesney aligns herself with within qualitative traditions. There are philosophical differences which are fairly divergent between the two approaches. And these are contrasted for you and highlighted in these first assumptions. So in terms of the ontological differences or the beliefs about the nature of reality, the positivist or quantitative researcher believes that social facts have an objective reality. In other words, that reality exists outside of ourselves, and there are universal truths that can be discovered through objective observation. These ways of knowing, or these assumptions about the nature of knowledge and the nature of reality, are very much grounded in the natural sciences and the scientific method, which, as you know, originated in the physical sciences, chemistry and biology, etc., and has really been around since the Middle Ages. So, there are some objective truths. Reality exists in some static way outside of ourselves, and we can discover it through our five senses, through observation and study and data collection, etc. Another assumption is that variables can be identified and relationships measured, and the researcher maintains his or her distance in a quantitative approach to maintain that presumed objectivity. And the assumption is that by maintaining objectivity and staying removed from the research process and not forming relationships with quote unquote subjects in a study, the researcher can prevent contaminating or influencing the variables in any way. You all are no doubt familiar with the scientific method and presumably learned about it in middle school or earlier, maybe in ninth grade biology, where you identify a problem, you formulate a hypothesis, you intervene in some way to test your hypothesis, which allows you to examine your results and either confirm or disconfirm your hypothesis. And you write that up in some fashion and discuss your results. That's very much the scientific method, which is empirical, grounded in what's reality that's outside of ourselves, that's observable, and quite objective in its approach to research. And even though qualitative methods have been practiced for a couple of centuries in certain branches of the social sciences, sociology and anthropology among them, psychology and education adopted the scientific method, this empiricist or positivist approach to research, and it's been dominant right up until the middle of our last century, until the middle of the 20th century. So I'm trying to do a couple different things here. I've brought you into a Prezi that I've developed on the Glesny chapter, and this particular image shows Thomas Kuhn's influential work that was published in mid-20th century, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn is a philosopher. He was at, and may still be at, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he and other scholars and researchers and practitioners from a number of traditions really questioned the positivist paradigmatic assumptions, so the values and beliefs of the positivist paradigm. And this critique had to do with questioning whether science is objective, whether it's neutral, and whether it's value-free. Kuhn said that data and observations are theory-led, so there's some context around them. They don't arrive out of a vacuum or arise out of a vacuum. Theory is paradigm-led, and paradigms are historically and culturally located. And so you begin to see the roots of present-day qualitative research assumptions that, in fact, everything is socially, historically, and culturally located and situated, and that it's very important to take into account that context. A paradigm is a framework or a philosophy of science that makes assumptions about the nature of reality and truth, the kinds of questions to explore, and how to go about doing so. Let's go back to that table in the Glesny reading. So you see the differences here between the underlying assumptions, philosophical and theoretical, between positivist approaches and interpretivist approaches. Qualitative researchers believe that reality is in fact socially constructed, and some of the traditions within qualitative research even believe that reality is co-created, that the researcher influences the quality of the research by his or her personhood, by his or her relationships and interactions with her participants, and that certainly that variables are complex, interwoven, and very difficult to measure. And this is in stark contrast to the assumptions of the positivist approach. So the research purposes for the quantitative researcher are proving causal, discovering causal explanations, proving cause and effect, the classic experimental design, where you have a control group that does not receive a treatment and an intervention group that does, and you then conduct your study, intervene with one group while holding the other group somewhat constant, and then measuring the differences in outcomes between the groups to prove causation that your intervention made a difference, if in fact there's a difference in the scores between the two groups. Glesny says a bit more eloquently, the purpose of quantitative research is the intention of making generalizations about social phenomena, creating predictions concerning those phenomena, and providing causal explanations. Quantitative approaches generally begin with a theory about the problem or phenomena in question, and using that theory, the research poses several hypotheses, which, as you know from middle school, this is an educated guess, and then through carefully designed subject selection strategies, and note the use of the word subject, which has a power differential inferred, the use between the researcher and the subject. In qualitative research, that's one of the things that's been critiqued in quantitative research methods, and in fact that power differential is not appropriate and privileges the researcher in ways that are problematic. And the qualitative researcher very purposefully uses the word participant, so that research is conducted, it's conceptualized, conducted, and conceived together with the participants. So these hypotheses are tested through methods that are designed to be objective and to keep the researcher removed from subjects to avoid influencing behavior and responses. And as you know, certainly a good example is that Wolcott study. The researcher in qualitative traditions definitely forms a relationship. Certainly there are safeguards against ethical violations and boundary violations that govern qualitative research as well as quantitative research. But again, this is a very big difference in the approach between the relationship and the subject or the participant. Further, in quantitative research, data are reduced to numerical indices or quantifiable bits of information, which are then analyzed using statistical procedures to determine whether differences in scores are in fact statistically significant. In qualitative research, as you see in your table, the research approach, both traditions follow a similar rigorous procedure in conducting research. And I'll show you a visual on that in just a moment from the Prezi. But in your table, Glesny highlights that in qualitative research, the results may produce a hypothesis or a theory. In quantitative, they begin with hypotheses and theories. Quantitative, they use formal instruments, they're experimental, they use deductive reasoning, they use component analysis. Qualitative is the researcher is the instrument, and the relationships that he or she develops. Usually qualitative researchers spend prolonged time in the field. You saw that in the Wolcott study with Brad. That research was conducted over a 2-year period. And the quantitative article that you read for last week, the Hammer and Pianta article, that research also was labor intensive because it was part of a larger longitudinal study, but the current study was only conducted in the spring of one school year. And many times quantitative studies are conducted in a relatively short time frame compared to qualitative research. Qualitative research is also naturalistic in the natural environment, and that was a piece of the critique against positivism as well, that things done in laboratories and experiments are very different from public school classrooms in any town USA, and that whether we found something in a laboratory setting or not didn't necessarily mean that it would work in a public school setting. So a couple other points that highlight some of the differences. The qualitative researcher, it's problematic because there's only one letter difference between quantitative and qualitative, and it's the N and the L. But the qualitative researcher searches for patterns and actually seeks to ask questions to shed light on particular situations, poses questions at the conclusion of conducting research, seeks pluralism, complexity, and definitely makes minor use of numerical indices. And there's a very rich descriptive write-up, as you've seen in the little bit of works that we've read so far. The quantitative researcher uses abstract language in the write-up. Third person is traditional, although that's been critiqued as well. And as we've discussed, maintains detachment and an objective portrayal of findings and of the study, whereas the qualitative researcher strives for personal involvement and empathic. So a couple final points. It's important to remember that qualitative and quantitative research are frequently contrasted, just as we've just done. But their methods may be thought of more as on a continuum rather than either or a dichotomy. And in fact, the premier educational research organization and in the United States is AERA, the American Education Research Association. And over the past couple decades, scholars in both quantitative and qualitative traditions have been involved in a huge debate. And I'm happy to report that at this moment in time, for the last decade or so, they've reached a consensus that both traditions are valuable, they're rooted in different paradigmatic values and beliefs, both contribute to our knowledge base, both are essential for our understanding of this complex world that we live in, what shapes behavior, what works in terms of effective interventions for children and youth in our schools. And one of their most recent publications is in fact a handbook on complementary methods in education research. It was published in 2006, and the first 3 chapters of this book are really dedicated to this discourse, the dialogue between qualitative and quantitative researchers. What's complementary about complementary methods, and philosophies of educational research, epistemology and educational research. And epistemology refers to the nature of knowledge itself and the ethics of educational works. And then there are some, 40 chapters on different research traditions, both some purely qualitative, some purely quantitative, and some very radical and some very traditional. So really a powerful statement of the state of the field and beliefs of the validity of both kinds of research. Both quantitative and qualitative inquiries state a purpose, pose a problem, raise a question, define a research population, select a method, design a study, develop a time frame, collect and analyze data, and present outcomes. So there are underlying and practical similarities in the production of educational research across both traditions. They both rely on theory and are concerned with rigor. But again, it's important to remember that each is associated with a different set of values and beliefs that about the nature of knowledge, their epistemological beliefs, and the nature of reality itself, their ontological beliefs. This conversation and these considerations are important as you consider your research topic for the paper that you'll develop or the research proposal that you'll develop in our class, because I believe that your own beliefs and values about the nature of knowledge and the nature of reality shape the kinds of questions that you'll ask, and what you consider knowledge to be, not just the particular research questions that you might have. In other words, you're attracted to one tradition or another based on what you believe about how the world is and how it exists and what you value and want to highlight. So in summary, some of the key points and the different traditions that are presented in Glesney's chapter. She begins with a discussion and a critique of logical positivism, which is quantitative research methods. And in fact, she asserts that most positivist researchers today are in fact post-positivist because they've been influenced to some degree by the qualitative revolution and the critique of logical positivism. For example, they're more willing to discuss ambiguity in their results instead of black and white findings that show irrefutable evidence that their treatment worked. They're more willing to divulge a little bit more about themselves in the research process as the researcher, etc. So logical positivism has been around since the time of the Middle Ages. Their ontological belief is that truth is found through observations and experimentation and grounded in empiricism, what we can observe through our five senses. Auguste Comte was a 19th century philosopher who promoted the values of empiricism. Here he is. And as you know now, it's an approach to social science that emulates natural science. And the word positive comes from the fact that they're positive, or they're asserting that their discoveries are reliable, and this is concrete truth, concrete knowledge. The interpretivist paradigm, as you know, is associated with qualitative research. It's based on idealism, or an idealist philosophy. Idealists believe that the world cannot exist independent of the mind or of ideas. So it's not limited to what we can see and know through our five senses. Many different traditions of interpretivism have developed, but each shares the goal of understanding human ideas, actions, and interactions in specific contexts. So context, cultural, historical, social moments and contexts must be acknowledged. What's their belief about the nature of reality? That the world is socially constructed, complex, and ever-changing. So if you believe this, what methodology would naturally follow, or would you be more attracted to? This is a funny picture because it very clearly highlights the difference between the white researcher who goes in to a particular culture and studies that culture. And in fact, this brings up a point that I wanted to make, and that is that qualitative research methods aren't without their own dark history. In fact, as you know, many early qualitative researchers studied different cultures and truly exploited them. They went into these cultures with the express purpose of colonization, of exploiting the resources that they found there, stealing those resources, and really dominating and wiping out the populations of people that live there and taking over their resources for themselves. So certainly not completely altruistic motives. We said today, too, that qualitative research is governed by in-depth, long-term interactions with relevant persons in one or several sites. And two other paradigms that Glesney introduces you to are the critical theory paradigm and one more. Critical theorists are historical realists. That's their philosophical ontology. Reality is shaped by social, political, cultural, economic, and gender values crystallized over time. And in fact, critical theorists really seek emancipation for their participants. They not only do they want to maintain their distance, but in fact they want to go in and affect social change as a result of their research. There are also standpoint epistemologies. Those are described in the Glesney chapter. And critical feminist research. And finally, the final paradigm within the qualitative tradition that Glesney highlights is postmodern, postcolonial, the post-structural paradigm. These share a radical critique of the entire fabric of modern Western thinking from both within and outside of it. So their central purpose is deconstruction. In Glesney's chapter on page 13, Elizabeth St. Pierre elaborates on deconstruction. She says, one of the most significant effects of deconstruction is that it foregrounds the idea that language does not simply point to pre-existing things and ideas, but rather helps to construct them, and by extension, the world as we know it. In other words, we word the world. The way it is not natural. We have constructed the world as it is through language and cultural practice, and we can also deconstruct and reconstruct it. For example, the study of history, as it's been traditionally taught in classrooms in the United States, has come under heavy scrutiny and criticism, as you may know, because it's largely his story as told by the privileged white middle-class man who lived during those times, and there's very little record of the polyphony of voices of women, of children, of less privileged people, people living in poverty, people of color, other marginalized groups. And so a critique of that falls under the post-structural paradigm. So if you're still with me, congratulations. We've reached the end of this presentation, and I look forward greatly to entering into your discussions of the Wolcott-Oerstleder article as an example of qualitative traditions and the Hammer and Pianta article. Take care.